The wind, sharp as a newly honed blade, clawed at the loose planks of the cabin, whistling a mournful tune through every crack, a sound that seemed to echo the hollowness in Abigail Ross's own chest. She hunched closer to the dying embers in the stone hearth, pulling her threadbare shawl so tight it felt like a second skin, though it offered little real protection against the insidious chill seeping through the walls. Outside, the Nebraska prairie stretched vast and unforgiving, a monotonous canvas of brittle brown under a sky the color of old pewter, a sky that promised nothing but more hardship. It was late October, and the bite in the air was a cruel forewarning of an early, bitter winter. On the rough-hewn table, a single tallow candle sputtered, its flame dancing fitfully, casting elongated, ghoulish shadows that made the small, sparsely furnished cabin seem even emptier, even more desolate. Beside it lay the paper, the foreclosure notice, stark white, official, and utterly, brutally cruel. 30 days, she whispered again, the words a dry rasp in her throat, lost almost immediately in the moan of the wind. It felt like a death sentence. The words had been delivered with a flourish by Marcus Thorne himself, a man whose portly figure was always clad in clothes too fine for Redemption Gulch, a man whose smile was as cold and hard as the coins he so diligently hoarded. 30 days to pay a debt her late husband, Samuel, had incurred with hopeful optimism, a debt now swollen to an impossible sum by 3 merciless years of relentless drought and the kind of bad luck that clings to a body like Burr's. 30 days. And now, as she stared at the smudged calendar page tacked to the wall, now there were only 10 left. 10 short, terrifying days until Serenity Springs, the farm Samuel had poured every ounce of his heart and sweat-drenched soul into, the only home Abigail had ever truly known, would be ruthlessly snatched away. She could still see Thorne's florid face, his eyes glittering with a mean sort of triumph, as he'd handed her that damning paper in the dusty main street of Redemption Gulch, right there for all the townsfolk to witness her humiliation. He'd enjoyed it, she knew with a sickening certainty. He thrived on the misfortunes of others. She rose, her joints stiff with a cold that seemed to have settled deep in her bones, her body aching with a weariness that went far beyond physical exertion. She walked to the small, grime-streaked window, peering out at the landscape that was a perfect, desolate mirror of her heart. Parched, barren, seemingly devoid of all life. Samuel, bless his eternally optimistic soul, had seen paradise here. He'd stood on this very spot, his arm around her shoulders, and pointed to the faintest trickle of water that gave the farm its achingly hopeful name. "It'll be good, Abby," he'd said, his voice warm with conviction, his eyes shining with that unshakable belief of his. "We'll make it good. This land, it's got a spirit. We just got to listen to it." And for a few precious years, it had been good. Hard years, yes, a constant grinding battle against the elements, against the sheer, overwhelming loneliness of the prairie. But those years were filled with the warmth of shared labor, with the echo of Samuel's easy laughter, with the quiet comfort of a love that was as steady and dependable as the sunrise. Then the lung fever had come, swift and brutal, stealing Samuel's breath, then his life, leaving Abigail adrift in an ocean of grief, clutching the broken remnants of his dreams, and a mountain of sorrow that threatened to crush her. And then, as if the heavens themselves had decided to heap misery upon misery, the rains stopped coming. Not just stopped, but vanished utterly, as if someone powerful and malicious, someone like Thorne perhaps, had turned off the celestial tap for good and thrown away the key. Her stomach growled, a hollow, aching protest, a visceral reminder of the last meager slice of dry cornbread she'd forced down that morning, a meal that had done little to appease the gnawing hunger. The flour sack in the corner was depressingly light, almost empty. The root cellar, once Samuel's pride, a testament to their small prosperities, now held little more than a few shriveled potatoes, their skins like old parchment, and a handful of onions that were starting to sprout feebly in the damp gloom. "Lord have mercy," she thought, the familiar prayer escaping her lips more like a sigh of resignation these days than a plea for divine intervention. "What am I to do? Where can I turn?" Giving up wasn't in her nature. Samuel had often praised her stubborn spirit. He wouldn't have given up, Not Samuel. He would have fought tooth and nail with every fiber of his being. But even the strongest will, she was learning, could be ground down to dust by the relentless, unyielding pressure of hardship upon hardship. She was tired, so very, very tired. Tired of the endless, thankless struggle. Tired of the crushing weight of solitude. Tired of this suffocating, all-consuming feeling of hopelessness that seemed to drain the very marrow from her bones. The day wore on, each deliberate, echoing tick of the old mantel clock. Samuel's grandmother's clock, a merciless drumbeat counting down the precious few hours towards her inevitable ruin. She tried to busy herself, her fingers clumsy as she mended yet another tear in Samuel's old canvas coat, a coat she now wore constantly, both for its meager warmth against the encroaching cold and for the faint, comforting scent of him that still clung to its worn fabric. But her mind, traitorous and unruly, kept drifting back to Thorne, to his smug, fleshy face, his dismissive wave of the hand as he delivered the notice, making a public spectacle of her plight. He wanted this land, she knew. Not for farming, heavens no. Thorne wasn't a man who would ever willingly dirty his hands with honest labor. He wanted the water rights, however small and unreliable they had become, the rights that were tied to Serenity Springs. He had plans, big, ambitious plans, for the entire valley, whispered rumors of a cattle empire or something even grander, and she, Abigail Ross, was just an inconvenient, stubborn obstacle in his path. A speck of dust to be brushed aside. As dusk, with its long, mournful shadows, began to bleed across the vast, indifferent sky, painting it in bruised shades of purple and gray, a new sound pricked her ears, a sound distinct and separate from the ceaseless, sorrowful moan of the wind. Hoofbeats, slow, tired, uneven hoofbeats approaching the cabin. Her heart leaped into her throat, a frantic, trapped bird. Thorne? Had he come early, impatient to claim his prize? She scrambled for the old shotgun Samuel had always kept loaded and propped by the door, her hands trembling so violently she could barely grasp the cold metal of the barrel. Peeking through a narrow crack in the wooden shutter, her breath catching in her chest, she saw a figure, silhouetted against the fading light. Tall and gaunt, leading a horse that looked every bit as weary and downcast as its rider. A drifter. The prairie was full of them these days, men broken by the war, by bad luck, by dreams that had withered and died on the unforgiving frontier. Usually she'd offer a wary, curt greeting, perhaps a dipper of precious water if she could spare it, and then firmly send them on their way. Her solitude was a fragile shield, but tonight the raw desolation emanating from that slumped, defeated figure resonated too closely with the emptiness in her own soul. He stopped beside the dilapidated barn, a structure that leaned at a precarious angle, its weathered planks groaning in the wind, a stark and constant reminder of her inability to keep up with the endless repairs Samuel had once managed with such effortless competence. He just stood there for a long, silent moment, his head bowed, his shoulders slumped, as if the accumulated weight of the entire weary world rested squarely upon them. Then, with infinite slowness, with an air of utter exhaustion, he carefully eased himself down to the frozen ground, leaning his back against the rough, splintered wall of the barn. His horse, a bony, sad-eyed Appaloosa with prominent ribs, nudged his shoulder with its velvety muzzle, a silent gesture of comfort. Abigail watched, her fear warring with a strange, unexpected flicker of something else. Pity? No, it was more than that. Understanding, perhaps? She didn't know. But she knew with an acute, painful certainty what it felt like to be utterly alone, completely exhausted, and staring into the abyss of a future that held no comfort. The wind picked up suddenly, its voice rising to a keening howl, carrying with it the first stinging, icy pellets of sleet. A storm was coming. A real one. The kind that could trap a person for days, the kind that could kill. She couldn't just leave him out there, exposed to the full fury of it. Samuel wouldn't have, the thought came, unbidden but clear, a whisper from a gentler past. Samuel, for all his practicality, had a soft heart for man and beast in dire straits. Taking a deep, steadying breath, trying to quell the frantic thumping of her heart, she unlatched the cabin door, the shotgun still held tight in her white-knuckled grip. You there?" she called out, her voice surprisingly stronger, clearer than she expected, carrying over the rising shriek of the wind. "Mister!" The man looked up slowly, his movements stiff, pained. His face was deeply shadowed by the wide brim of a battered, shapeless hat, but even in the gathering gloom, she could see a rough, untamed beard, streaked with premature gray. He didn't speak, he just looked. "Storm's coming on fierce," she said, shouting now to be heard above the wind. "The barn ain't much. I know it's falling apart, but it's shelter. You and your horse can stay the night. There's still a little hay left up in the loft, not prime, but it'll keep the chill off." He just looked at her, his silence vast and unsettling, more unnerving than any angry words might have been. She felt a sudden need to fill that silence, to justify her rash offer. "I ain't got much to offer in the way of food," she added, her voice faltering slightly. "Barely enough for myself. But no man, nor beast, should be left out in what's coming tonight." He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, a tiny movement of his head that she almost missed. Then, with what seemed like a monumental, agonizing effort, he slowly, painfully got to his feet, each movement a testament to his exhaustion, and led his equally weary horse towards the dilapidated barn door, which sagged drunkenly on one rusty hinge. He managed to wrestle it open just enough to slip inside with the animal. Abigail watched him go, a knot of apprehension tightening in her stomach, then quickly retreated into the relative safety of the cabin, bolting the door firmly behind her, even propping a chair under the knob for good measure. "Lord, what have I done?" she wondered, sinking onto a stool by the cold hearth. Inviting a complete stranger, a silent, rough-looking, potentially dangerous man, onto her isolated property when she was all alone. It was foolish, reckless, the act of a desperate woman. But the indelible image of him, slumped and beaten by the barn, his shoulders bowed under an invisible weight, wouldn't leave her. She spent a long, restless night, huddled in her thin blankets, listening to the storm rage outside with untamed fury, the wind howling like a hungry wolf, the sleet lashing against the cabin walls. And through it all, she strained her ears for any sound from the barn, any sign that she had made a terrible, fatal mistake. But all she heard was the symphony of the storm, and occasionally the soft, rhythmic rustle of hay, the contented snort of a horse. The next morning, the world was transformed, hushed and white. A thick, pristine blanket of snow covered everything in sight, muffling all sound, creating an eerie, beautiful stillness. The storm had passed, leaving behind a biting, crystalline cold and a landscape of treacherous, dazzling beauty. Abigail's first anxious thought was of the man in the barn. Was he all right? Had he frozen in that drafty, decaying structure? She bundled herself as best she could in Samuel's heavy coat, its familiar weight a small comfort, and trudged through the deep, newly fallen snow towards the barn. The barn door was closed, pulled to against the snowdrifts. She pushed it open a crack, her heart thumping a nervous rhythm. The man was awake. He was sitting on an overturned wooden bucket, his back straight, methodically mending a large tear in his horse's worn blanket with a needle and what looked like a piece of sinew, his movements precise and economical despite the cold. His hat was off, resting on the hay beside him, revealing a face deeply lined by sun and wind and untold hardship, and eyes of a startling, clear, intelligent blue. Eyes that seemed to see right through her, to peer into the very depths of her weary soul. He looked up as she entered, his gaze steady, unblinking. But again, he said nothing. "Morning," Abigail managed, her breath pluming in the frigid air of the barn. "Survived the night, I see." He nodded once, curtly, his gaze returning to his careful mending. The silence stretched, thick and cold. "There's coffee on the stove," she offered, the words feeling inadequate. "And I can spare a biscuit, maybe two. Not much, but it's hot." It was more than she could truly spare, especially with her flour sack so low, but the words were out, an offering against the vastness of his silence and her own gnawing loneliness. He finished his stitch with meticulous care, bit the thread cleanly with his teeth, and then finally he spoke. His voice, when it came, was raspy, gravelly, as if dragged up from a deep, unused well. Obliged. That was all. Just that one word. Obliged. He rose stiffly and followed her through the snow to the cabin. The silence between them as they walked was thick, heavy, yet not, Abigail found herself thinking, entirely uncomfortable. It was a silence of shared hardship, perhaps, of unspoken understanding. He ate the hard biscuits slowly, methodically, savoring each bite, and drank the bitter, chicory-laced coffee from a chipped tin mug, his eyes taking in the small, sparse, meticulously clean cabin. She found herself noticing, with a fresh pang of shame, the threadbare curtains, the patched quilt on her narrow cot, the general air of poverty and neglect, all seen through his discerning gaze. When he was done, he rose from the stool. "Pump's broken," he stated, his voice flat, more an observation than a question, looking towards the old iron hand pump outside the kitchen window, now heavily crusted with ice and snow. "Been broken for years," Abigail confirmed with a weary sigh that seemed to carry the weight of all those waterless seasons. "Samuel, my husband, he tried to fix it countless times, but—" She shrugged, a gesture of helplessness. "Some things just stay broken, I suppose." He nodded again, that same curt, economical movement. Then, without another word, he went outside into the biting wind. Abigail watched from the window, a flicker of curiosity warring with her ingrained weariness. He walked slowly around the frozen pump, examining it from all angles like a doctor assessing a difficult patient. He chipped away the thick rime of ice with a piece of scrap metal he found lying near the woodpile. Then he went to the barn and returned a few minutes later carrying Samuel's old, rusty toolbox, a relic she hadn't been able to bring herself to open since Samuel's passing. For the next 2, perhaps 3, arduous hours, in the face of the numbing cold and a wind that seemed determined to flay the skin from his bones, he worked on that stubborn, frozen pump. He dismantled parts of it with surprising dexterity, his fingers, though chapped and raw, moving with purpose. He cleaned away years of accumulated rust and grime, hammered recalcitrant pieces back into shape, twisted, tightened, and painstakingly reassembled the mechanism. Abigail, wrapped in her thickest shawl, brought him a dipper of precious hot water from the kettle now and then, which he used to thaw frozen joints and warm his stiffening fingers. She fully expected him to give up, to curse the useless thing and walk away. Samuel, a capable man, had. But this stranger, Silas, he persisted, his movements economical, precise, utterly focused, his jaw set in a line of grim determination. He seemed like a man who didn't know the meaning of defeat, or perhaps one who had known it too well and refused to bow to it again. And then the improbable, the unbelievable happened. A reluctant groan of long frozen metal, a hesitant sucking sound from deep within the earth. And then water. A thin, hesitant trickle at first, then a stronger, clearer, colder gush of pure, life-giving water, splashing triumphantly onto the snow-covered ground, steaming slightly in the frigid air. Abigail gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief. She hadn't seen water flow from that pump in over 3 long, dry, heartbreaking years. The man, Silas, straightened up slowly from his crouched position, his back obviously aching. He wiped his soiled hands on his worn trousers and looked directly at her, his face impassive except for the faintest flicker of something quiet satisfaction. Hard-won pride? That touched the corners of his stern mouth and softened, just for an instant, the harsh lines around his remarkable blue eyes. "Needs a new leather washer soon," he said, his voice still raspy but with a new note of finality. "But it'll hold for now. Should give you enough for your needs." Abigail was speechless, tears pricking at the corners of her eyes, tears of shock and overwhelming relief. How on earth did you do that?" she finally managed to stammer. He just shrugged, a small, almost dismissive gesture. "Things just need understanding," he said, his gaze returning to the flowing water as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "And sometimes a firm hand. Most things ain't as broken as they seem." His name, she learned later that long, eventful day, was Silas. He didn't offer it freely. She had to coax it out of him, her curiosity finally overcoming her reticence. "Silas," he'd said, his voice low, and then nothing more, as if the single word was a burden. He stayed. He didn't ask if he could, and Abigail, still stunned and profoundly grateful for the miraculous resurrection of her well pump, a true lifeline, didn't have the heart, or the inclination, to ask him to leave. What was one more mouth to feed, especially a mouth that seemed to ask for so little, when that mouth came attached to hands that could perform such small, vital miracles? The heavy snow kept them isolated from Redemption Gulch and the rest of the world for 3 more long days. During that unexpected reprieve, Silas, with that same quiet, relentless, focused energy, set about fixing things around the dilapidated farmstead. He repaired the main barn door so it hung straight on its hinges and closed tight against the wind. He secured the loose, banging shutters on the cabin, silencing their mournful complaint. He even, to Abigail's astonishment, managed to clamber onto the icy barn roof and skillfully patch the gaping hole where shingles had been torn off by a storm last spring, using salvaged pieces of wood and some tar Samuel had left behind. He worked from the first gray light of dawn until the last vestiges of dusk faded from the sky, rarely speaking more than a few necessary words, moving with a steady, unwavering purpose that served as a silent, powerful reproach to Abigail's own listless, encroaching despair. She found herself bringing him her meager meals, what little was left of some salt pork, a bit more of the rapidly dwindling cornbread, hot coffee. He accepted them silently, gravely, always with that same curt nod, but she began to see something in his eyes, a flicker of guarded warmth, perhaps, that looked almost like gratitude. She found herself watching him constantly, a strange fascination growing within her. He had an uncanny way with his hands, an intuitive knack for understanding how things worked, or more importantly, how they should work. He seemed to require very little for himself, a bit of food, a place to sleep on the rough hay in the barn, and the silent companionship of his equally stoic Appaloosa, which he cared for with a surprising, gentle solicitude, sharing his own meager water rations with the animal. Abigail fell into a new rhythm, leaving a portion of her own scant meals for him by the barn door each evening. He always ate it, every last crumb, and the empty plate was always returned to her doorstep by morning, meticulously clean. Slowly, cautiously, a strange kind of unspoken routine, a fragile understanding began to settle between them. Abigail would attend to her few remaining chores, milking her one scrawny cow, Buttercup, whose ribs were now starkly visible, tending the tiny flame in the hearth. Silas, in turn, would invariably find something that needed mending, something that could be improved, his industry a quiet force against the relentless decay of the farm. The silence between them was still a constant presence, a vast, prairie-like expanse. But it was changing subtly. It felt less like an empty void, more like a shared space, a quiet acknowledgement of their mutual isolation and struggle. Sometimes their eyes would meet across the snowy yard, or over a shared, humble meal eaten in the dim cabin light, and Abigail would see in his clear blue eyes not just weariness and old pain, but a deep, hidden sadness, and also sometimes a fleeting spark of something else, something resilient, something she couldn't quite name, but that stirred a faint answering ember of hope within her own heart. When the deep snow finally began to melt under a reluctant, watery sun, revealing the sodden, still barren, unforgiving earth, Abigail knew with a sinking heart that the merciless clock was ticking faster now, louder. Only a few days left until Thorne would come to claim his pound of flesh. The miraculously repaired pump, the mended barn, the secured shutters. These were wonderful, tangible improvements, small victories against the encroaching ruin. But they wouldn't pay Marcus Thorne. They wouldn't satisfy the cold, impersonal demands of the bank. Despair, which had receded slightly, pushed back by the sheer force of Silas's quiet, unyielding industry, came flooding back with a vengeance, cold and suffocating. One bleak morning, she found Silas standing in the middle of her small, dead vegetable garden, a patch of earth she hadn't had the heart to even look at for months. He was just standing there, motionless, looking down at the cracked, lifeless soil, at the withered, blackened stalks of last year's beans and squash, skeletal reminders of past failures. He bent down, crumbled some of the dry, dusty soil between his rough fingers, brought it to his nose, his expression unreadable. What on earth is he thinking? Abigail wondered, watching him from the cabin window. Then, with that same deliberate slowness, he went to the barn, emerging a few moments later with Samuel's old, rust-caked spade and a heavy hoe, tools Abigail hadn't had the strength or the spirit to touch since Samuel's passing. And he began to dig. He didn't just turn the soil with brute force. He seemed to be listening to it, coaxing it, his movements patient, almost reverent, as if he were tending a fragile, sleeping thing. He cleared away the dead, tangled stalks, dug out the stubborn rocks and roots with meticulous care, his breathing steady and even in the crisp air. He started building up small, neat raised beds, using flat stones he'd gathered from the creek bank to line them, creating order out of chaos. He then went down to the shallow, meandering creek bed, where the springs that gave the farm its name still trickled, a pathetic shadow of their former selves. For hours he worked there, clearing away the accumulated debris, the fallen leaves and tangled branches that choked the meager flow, patiently coaxing a slightly stronger, steadier stream of precious water. Then, using 2 old, battered buckets he'd found in the barn, he began to haul water, load after arduous load, up the slight incline to the newly prepared garden beds, painstakingly soaking the dry, thirsty earth until it was dark and damp. "What in creation are you doing, Silas?" Abigail finally asked late that afternoon, unable to contain her bewildered curiosity any longer, her voice tinged with a skepticism she couldn't quite hide. He looked up from his labor, his face streaked with sweat and grime despite the coolness of the day, his blue eyes surprisingly serious, intense. "Land's thirsty," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Real thirsty. And hungry too. Needs a good long drink first. Then it needs food. Proper food." Food? What food could she possibly offer the barren, depleted land? Her own stores were all but gone. But Silas, it seemed, knew things she didn't. He started a compost heap behind the barn, a new purposeful mound in the otherwise desolate yard, using the few vegetable scraps from her kitchen. Cartloads of dry, fallen leaves he raked from under the lone cottonwood tree by Samuel's grave, and the precious manure from his own horse and her one scrawny cow, Buttercup. He explained, in his characteristically terse, economical way, that this mixture, left to rot and decompose, would become rich, dark, life-giving food for the starving soil. He then surprised her further by producing a small, forgotten, cloth-wrapped packet of seeds he'd found tucked away in a corner of Samuel's old leather possibles bag, some hardy-looking beans, a few precious kernels of a tough, resilient strain of prairie corn. Seeds Abigail had long given up on, assuming them to be as dead as her hopes. "We plant these," he said, holding them out on his broad, calloused palm as if they were priceless jewels. "Give the land a chance. Give them a chance." It seemed an act of utter, almost ludicrous, hopelessness. The foreclosure was mere days away. What earthly good could a handful of doubtful seeds possibly do against the might of Marcus Thorne and the implacable bank? But there was a quiet, unshakable certainty in Silas's voice, a deep, unwavering conviction in his steady blue eyes that made Abigail hesitate to voice her crushing doubts. So, with a sigh that was part resignation, part a desperate, illogical flicker of something she dared not name, she found herself working beside him, her fingers stiff and clumsy as she dropped the precious tiny seeds into the cool, damp earth he had so carefully prepared, covering them gently as he instructed. It felt like a fool's errand, a child's game, a prayer whispered into the teeth of a gathering hurricane. But it was something. It was action, not passive despair. And for the very first time in what felt like an eternity, a tiny, fragile, almost imperceptible shoot of hope, no bigger or more substantial than one of those buried seeds, began to unfurl tentatively, hesitantly, within the barren soil of her own heart. Marcus Thorne, as if summoned by that very flicker of nascent hope, chose that precise moment to make an unwelcome appearance. He rode up to the cabin on his fine, glossy black gelding, the animal's sleekness a stark contrast to the gauntness of Silas's Appaloosa. Thorn himself looked prosperous and self-satisfied, a smug look firmly plastered on his fleshy face. Deputy Miller, looking nervous and out of place, trailed a few paces behind him like a poorly trained cur. "Well, well, Mrs. Ross," Thorn boomed, his voice dripping with ill-concealed sarcasm, his dismissive eyes taking in Silas, the newly turned earth of the garden, the general air of desperate activity. "Playing in the dirt, are we?" A touching, if entirely futile, display of rustic charm. "The bank, I'm afraid, Mrs. Ross is not known for its sentimentality when it comes to overdue accounts." Abigail straightened her aching back, her chin lifting, a spark of Samuel's old defiance flaring in her eyes. "This is my land, Mr. Thorn," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, even though her insides were churning with a mixture of fear and resentment. "Until the bank officially says otherwise, I'll do with it as I please, and I please to work it." Thorn chuckled, a short, unpleasant, grating sound. "Spirit. I almost admire it in a woman. Almost. But spirit, madam, don't pay mortgages. 3 days. 3 short days. Remember that?" He shot a sharp, assessing glance at Silas, a flicker of something unreadable. Annoyance? Fleeting curiosity? In his cold, calculating eyes. "Still got your drifter, I see. Hope you're not wasting good money paying him. You'll need every last cent you can scrape together, though I doubt it will be enough." He tipped his expensive hat in that infuriating, mocking parody of politeness, and then reined his horse around, riding off without a backward glance, Deputy Miller scurrying to keep up. The encounter left Abigail shaken, her hands trembling, the fragile shoot of hope wilting under the heat of Thorn's contempt. But beneath the fear, a new, unfamiliar feeling was stirring. Anger. A cold, hard knot of anger at Thorn's arrogance, his casual, unthinking cruelty, his blatant enjoyment of her suffering. That anger fueled a spark of stubborn defiance in her. She looked over at Silas. He was already back at work, seemingly unfazed by Thorn's visit, carefully, methodically tamping down the soil around a newly planted bean seed, his expression as unreadable as a stone. "He aims to break you," Silas said, his voice quiet, flat, without looking up from his task. "That's what men like him do. They feed on the weakness of others." "He won't," Abigail said, the words tasting like a solemn, bitter vow on her tongue. "He won't. Not while I still draw breath." The next 2 days passed in a blur of relentless, back-breaking activity, a desperate race against the implacable march of the clock. Silas, with an almost uncanny, preternatural intuition, seemed to know exactly what the parched, depleted land needed. He rigged up a simple but ingenious irrigation system, using hollowed-out sections of fallen cottonwood limbs to channel the meager, precious flow from the rejuvenated springs directly to the thirsty garden beds. He showed Abigail how to mulch around the delicate emerging seedlings with handfuls of straw he'd found in a forgotten corner of the barn, explaining in his quiet way how it would conserve the precious moisture and keep the weeds at bay. He worked tirelessly, relentlessly, from before the first pale light of dawn painted the eastern sky until well after the last sliver of sun had dipped below the western horizon, fueled by a grim, silent determination that awed and slightly frightened Abigail. And she worked beside him, matching his pace as best she could, her initial profound skepticism slowly, almost imperceptibly, giving way to a reluctant, burgeoning belief. She saw the meticulous care he took with each tiny plant, the almost reverent way he handled the soil, the deep, quiet satisfaction in his eyes when a new seedling unfurled its first tender leaves. He wasn't just a drifter, a wandering handyman. There was something more to him, something profound, a deep, hidden well of knowledge about the earth and its secret rhythms. And then, on the very morning before the foreclosure was due to take place, the impossible happened. Pushing bravely, defiantly, through the cool, damp earth in the newly tended garden were tiny green shoots. Not just 1 or 2, but dozens of them. The beans, the corn, they had sprouted, against all odds, against all reason, in soil that had been barren and lifeless for years. Life was stirring, asserting itself. Abigail stared, her vision blurring with sudden, unexpected tears. She sank to her knees on the damp ground, reaching out with a trembling finger to gently touch a tender, vibrant green leaf, so small, so fragile, yet so incredibly powerfully alive. It was a miracle. A small, humble, fragile miracle, to be sure, but a miracle nonetheless. Silas stood beside her, his tall, lean figure casting a long shadow in the early morning light. A rare, almost gentle expression softened the harsh lines of his weathered face. "Land remembers," he said softly, his voice barely a whisper on the cool morning air. "Always remembers. Just needs a reason to wake up. A little kindness." But a few dozen green shoots, however miraculous, however symbolic, wouldn't stop a man like Marcus Thorne. At 10 o'clock sharp, as the sun climbed towards its zenith in a clear, unforgiving sky, he arrived. He was not alone. He was accompanied by Mr. Henderson, the nervous, perpetually sweating, balding bank manager from Redemption Gulch, whose eyes darted about like those of a trapped rabbit, and by two burly, grim-faced men Abigail didn't recognize, men who looked far more like hired muscle, like thugs, than respectable bank clerks. A small, subdued crowd of townsfolk had gathered at a respectful distance by the roadside, drawn by the grim magnetism of the impending drama. Some faces in the crowd looked sympathetic, others merely curious, a few openly hostile towards Thorne. "Mrs. Ross," Thorne began, his voice unctuously smooth like oiled leather, a predatory gleam in his eyes. "A sad day, a most regrettable day. But the law, as you know, Mrs. Ross, is the law. The debt is outstanding. The bank, with considerable reluctance, of course, must take possession of the property." Henderson nodded nervously, his Adam's apple bobbing, studiously avoiding Abigail's direct gaze. Abigail stood ramrod straight on her narrow porch, her hands clasped tightly in front of her to still their trembling. Silas stood a pace behind her, a silent, imposing, rock-solid presence at her back. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice surprisingly clear and steady, carrying easily in the still morning air. "I ask only for a little more time. A few more weeks. Look." She gestured with a sweep of her hand towards the small, newly green garden, where the tiny, vibrant shoots were clearly visible, a defiant splash of color against the dun earth. "There's life here now. The farm can be productive again. I know it can." Thorne let out a short, ugly, barking laugh. "A few pitiful weeds, madam? That's your collateral? That's your grand plan to repay a substantial debt? I think not. Henderson, you may proceed with the eviction." The two burly men took a menacing step forward, their faces impassive. Abigail's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. This was it. It was truly over. All their work, all Silas's efforts, all for nothing. "Hold on there." The voice was quiet, measured, but it cut through the tense atmosphere like a razor-sharp knife. Silas stepped forward smoothly, effortlessly, positioning himself directly between Abigail and Thorne's advancing men. He wasn't armed, not visibly. He carried no weapon she could see, but there was something in his stance, a calm, rooted immovability, and in the unwavering, piercing intensity of his direct blue gaze that made the two thugs hesitate, then halt, an uncertain flicker in their eyes. "This woman has worked this land with her own two hands," Silas said, his voice low even, but carrying an undeniable weight of authority. "She's poured her sweat and her tears into it. She deserves a chance, a fair chance. Not threats and bullying." Thorne sneered, his face flushing an ugly red. "And who in blue blazes are you, drifter, to tell me my business? Or the bank's? Get out of the way, you penniless vagrant, or my men will be obliged to move you, and it won't be gentle." "He's not just a drifter, Thorne, and he's certainly not penniless in spirit or knowledge." All heads in the assembled crowd turned as one. Pushing his way determinedly through the small knot of onlookers was old Jedediah Stone, the town's long-retired but highly respected assayer, a man renowned throughout the county for his unwavering honesty and his sharp, discerning mind. Beside him, her chin held high, walked Martha Evans, a fellow widow who ran the small but popular bakery in town, a woman known for her kindness and her quiet strength. And behind them, trailed a half-dozen other familiar faces from Redemption Gulch, small, struggling farmers, the blacksmith, the wheelwright people who had also, at one time or another, felt the cold, constricting squeeze of Marcus Thorne's unbridled ambition. "This here," Jedediah announced, his voice ringing with a surprising, firm authority that commanded immediate attention, "is Silas Blackwood. Or, as some of us who hailed from back east knew him years ago, Professor Silas Blackwood, one of the foremost, most respected agronomists in the entire country. Before certain unscrupulous parties saw fit to ruin his stellar reputation and brazenly steal his groundbreaking research." A stunned, collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Marcus Thorne's florid face went slack, the color draining from it as if a plug had been pulled, leaving it a pasty, unhealthy gray. He stared at Silas, truly looked at him this time, and a flicker of horrified recognition, then stark, unadulterated fear, dawned in his wide, bulging eyes. "Blackwood," he whispered, the name a strangled sound in his throat. Silas just looked back at him, his expression as unchanging, as implacable as the prairie sky. "It seems, Mr. Thorne," Jedediah continued, his voice relentless, pressing his advantage, "that some of Professor Blackwood's invaluable stolen research on dryland farming techniques and soil reclamation research he dedicated his life to somehow found its way into your possession some years back. Research you subsequently tried, with very little notable success, I might add, to pass off as your own. And some of us here, Mr. Thorne, are in possession of letters, scientific correspondences, irrefutable documents, proving Professor Blackwood's original authorship of that pioneering work. Work that could, with proper knowledgeable application, make this entire valley bloom, to the benefit of all, not just one greedy man." Thorne sputtered, his composure completely shattered. This is outrageous. An absurd conspiracy, preposterous lies." But his bluster was hollow, his denial unconvincing. The damage was done. The crowd was murmuring excitedly, looking from Thorne to Silas and back again, their expressions a mixture of shock, dawning understanding, and growing anger. Mr. Henderson, the unfortunate bank manager, looked like he desperately wished the earth would open up and swallow him whole. He'd clearly been an unwitting, or perhaps not so unwitting, pawn in Thorne's nefarious game. "Furthermore," Martha Evans spoke up then, her voice clear and strong, resonating with conviction, "we, the undersigned good citizens of this community, are prepared to offer Mrs. Ross a private loan from our own modest means, sufficient to cover her immediate debt to the bank. We believe in her, Mr. Henderson. We believe in her tenacity, and we most certainly believe in Professor Blackwood's proven ability to make this farm, and indeed other farms in this valley, prosper once more." She held up a sheet of paper, upon which were scrawled a dozen or more signatures, a testament to newfound community solidarity. Thorne was trapped, cornered, exposed. His bluster deflated like a pricked balloon. The two burly men he'd brought for intimidation looked confused. Then, sensing the shift in power, slowly, almost sheepishly, backed away, melting into the edges of the crowd. The public humiliation, the shocking exposure of his past theft and deceit, the unexpected unified solidarity of the townsfolk. It was too much, even for a man of his arrogance. He knew when he was beaten, decisively and irrevocably. Without another word, his face a mask of impotent fury and disbelief, he turned abruptly, practically leaped onto his fine horse, and rode away at a gallop, his grand dreams of dominating the valley, of building his empire on the ruin of others, crumbling into dust around him. Mr. Henderson, after a hurried, whispered, and visibly uncomfortable consultation with Jedediah Stone and Martha Evans, stammered a profuse, if insincere, apology to Abigail, and hastily agreed to accept the private loan to clear her outstanding debt with the bank. As the crowd began to disperse, still buzzing with the astonishing events of the morning, their voices a low hum of speculation and excitement, Abigail turned to Silas. Professor Blackwood, tears, this time of profound relief and overwhelming gratitude, streamed unchecked down her face. "You, all this time, you knew him? You knew what he was?" Silas nodded, a shadow passing briefly over his face. Thorne was a junior associate, an assistant, at the university where I once taught. Ambitious even then, unscrupulous. He coveted my research, my position. He spread insidious lies, fabricated evidence. He ruined me. He looked out at the small, brave green shoots in the garden, a poignant symbol of new beginnings. I lost everything. My work, my reputation, my name. I just wandered. For years. Aimless. Lost. Until I ended up here. At your door. He met her gaze then, and for the first time, a genuine, unguarded hint of a smile touched his lips, crinkling the corners of his remarkable blue eyes. Seemed like this land, and you, Mrs. Ross, needed a firm hand. And maybe, he added, his voice dropping to barely a whisper, a confession of shared vulnerability. Maybe so did I. Abigail didn't know what to say. Words seemed inadequate, trivial, in the face of such profound revelation, such quiet heroism. She just reached out, her hand trembling slightly, and took his strong, calloused, earth-stained hand in hers. "Thank you, Silas," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for everything. For giving me back my hope. For saving Serenity Springs." The farm, Serenity Springs, didn't magically transform into a lush paradise overnight. There was still an immense amount of hard work to be done, endless, back-breaking toil under the prairie sun. But now, crucially, there was hope. Real, tangible, life-affirming hope. With Silas's unparalleled knowledge and the newfound enthusiastic support of their neighbors, who now looked upon Professor Blackwood with a mixture of awe and respect, the land began to respond, to heal. The springs, under Silas's careful, intuitive management, flowed a little stronger, a little clearer each day. The crops, nurtured with his expert, loving care, grew tall and green and surprisingly abundant. That first, crucial harvest wasn't a bountiful one by the standards of lusher lands, but it was enough. More than enough. Enough to repay the community loan, enough to see them comfortably through the coming winter with food in the cellar and grain in the barn, enough to prove, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that Serenity Springs, against all odds, could live and thrive again. Silas stayed. He never spoke of leaving, and Abigail never asked. It was simply understood. He and Abigail worked side by side, day in and day out, transforming that barren, windswept patch of prairie into a small, productive, vibrant farm, a beacon of what was possible. He began to teach others in the valley his innovative methods, generously sharing the knowledge that Marcus Thorne had so despicably tried to steal and suppress. Redemption Gulch slowly began to change, to hope, to believe in a better future. And Abigail Ross, the once desperate, isolated widow, found not just her farm again, not just her livelihood, but her strength, her purpose, and in the quiet, steadfast, reassuring presence of Silas Blackwood, a deep, abiding companionship, and a quiet love she never, ever expected to find again in her lifetime. The land, it turned out, wasn't the only thing that could be brought back to life with care and understanding. Sometimes, all it took was a silent drifter with a hidden past, a wealth of forgotten knowledge, and the simple, unwavering courage to plant a single seed of hope in seemingly barren ground, 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 seemingly barren ground.